The snow fell without mercy on Christmas Eve, 1883, covering the forgotten train station at Redemption, Montana, in a silence so profound it felt like the earth itself had stopped breathing. Each flake descended with the weight of a secret settling onto the warped wooden platform where frost had already claimed every surface, turning the world into something brittle and unforgiving. The wind did not howl. It whispered, carrying with it the kind of cold that makes men question whether warmth was ever real or merely a dream they once believed in. Elias Morgan reined his mare to a halt beneath the station's skeletal awning, his breath clouding the twilight air in short, reluctant bursts. He was 35 years old, though his eyes held the weariness of a man twice that age. The lines carved around his mouth spoke of words left unspoken, of conversations with ghosts that never answered back. His coat, heavy wool the color of charcoal, hung on his lean frame like a penance he wore daily. In his saddlebag, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from the snow, lay a single envelope, a letter. The kind of letter a man writes when he has finally decided that silence is no longer an option, no matter the cost. The station was supposed to be empty. It should have been. On Christmas Eve, even the ticket master had abandoned his post, leaving only a sign that read, "Closed until December 26th," in fading letters. Elias had counted on this emptiness. He needed the solitude to slip the letter into the outbound mail slot, to commit the act that would change everything without having to look another human being in the eye while doing it. But the station was not empty. She lay on a wooden bench near the far end of the platform, so still that at first Elias mistook her for a pile of discarded fabric someone had left behind. Snow had gathered in her dark hair like scattered pearls, delicate and accusatory. Her dress was gray silk, a kippah cut in the traditional style, though the fabric had been worn thin by too many winters and too few warm places. The high collar was torn at one side, revealing the pale curve of her neck, where frost had begun to claim her skin. Elias dismounted slowly, his boots making no sound against the fresh snow. He approached with the caution of a man who had learned that suffering often looks like sleep, that stillness can be either peace or its opposite. When he was close enough to see the shallow rise and fall of her chest, something in him that had been frozen for 5 years cracked just slightly. She was alive. Barely. Her fingers clutched something against her chest, and when Elias leaned closer, he saw it was a photograph old and creased from being held too tightly for too long. The image showed a family, a man, a woman, 2 children, Chinese faces staring at the camera with the solemn dignity of people who understood that photographs were expensive and therefore must capture something worth remembering. Elias did not wake her immediately. To do so felt like trespassing on whatever fragile thread was keeping her tethered to this world. Her face, even in unconsciousness, held a weariness that seemed carved into her bones. She was perhaps 22, though the hardness around her eyes suggested she had stopped counting birthdays long ago. The wind picked up, and Elias knew, with the certainty of a man who had spent decades in these mountains, that the temperature would drop another 10 degrees before midnight. If he left her here, she would be dead by morning. If he took her with him, he would be inviting a stranger into the carefully constructed isolation that had become his only form of survival. He had come here to confess, to send that letter and finally accept the consequences of what he had done 10 years ago. Taking her would delay that. It would complicate everything. Elias lifted her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, as if the years had slowly been eating away at her substance, leaving only the essential parts behind. As he carried her to his horse, her eyes fluttered open for just a moment. They were dark, the color of river stones, and they looked at him with neither fear nor gratitude, only a kind of distant recognition, as if she had been expecting him all along. Then they closed again, and she went limp in his arms. The ride back to his cabin took 40 minutes through deepening snow. Elias did not hurry. He held the girl carefully positioned so that his body would shield her from the worst of the wind. His mare Bess moved with the steady patience of an animal who had carried burdens before and understood that some loads required gentleness. As they rode, Elias found himself remembering. He did not want to remember, but memory is not something a man can control, especially not on Christmas Eve, when the snow falls like absolution, and the world looks exactly as it did a decade ago, 1873. Elias had been 25, newly married to Sarah, full of ambition that felt like virtue. The transcontinental railroad was complete, but branch lines were spreading like roots through the western territories, and those lines needed workers, thousands of them. The companies did not care where the workers came from, only that they came cheap, and did not complain when the work killed them. Elias had started as a translator. He spoke some Cantonese learned from a merchant in San Francisco during his brief time working the docks. When the railroad contractors discovered this, they offered him a position, not as a laborer, as a labor contractor, a middleman. He would travel to San Francisco, to the crowded neighborhoods where Chinese immigrants lived in conditions that made poverty look like abundance, and he would offer them a better life, work, wages, a chance to build something in America. It was legal. The contracts were notarized. The men who signed them, or placed their thumbprints on the dotted lines because they could not write, did so willingly. Elias told himself this every night when he returned home to Sarah, who was growing rounder with their first child, who looked at him with eyes that held questions she was too kind to ask aloud. The work was brutal. Elias knew this. He had seen the camps, the men sleeping in canvas tents in winter, eating rice, and whatever meat had gone too old for anyone else to want. He had watched them tunnel into mountainsides with explosives that sometimes detonated too early, collapsing rock onto bodies that would never be recovered. He had counted the dead and revised the contracts to account for attrition rates. But it was legal. It was business. And Sarah was pregnant, and they needed the money. In the spring of 1873, Elias brought a group of 42 men, 3 women, and 7 children from San Francisco to work on the Montana line. They traveled in a converted livestock car, packed so tightly that standing was the only option. The journey took 6 days. When they arrived, 2 of the children were dead from dysentery. The company docked Elias's commission to account for the decreased head count. Among those 42 men were a father and son. Elias remembered them because the son had been young, perhaps 19, and he had looked at Elias with an expression that was neither anger nor hope, but something harder to define. Trust, maybe, or the desperate willingness to believe that trust might still exist in a world that had given him no reason to believe it. The father's name was Chen something. Elias never learned the family name. He never asked. 6 months later, there was an accident. A tunnel collapse in the mountains west of Redemption. 14 men died buried under tons of rock and frozen earth. The company paid for a mass grave and deducted the cost from the survivors' wages. Among the dead were the father and son. Elias remembered. He had learned this in a telegram. Dry words on paper. No details. Just names and a number. Elias never told Sarah. In October of 1873, their son was born. They named him Thomas. He had Sarah's eyes and Elias's stubborn chin. He was perfect in the way that only a first child can be perfect before the world has had a chance to prove that perfection is always temporary. Elias quit the contractor business 3 months later. He told the railroad company he was done. They did not argue. There were always other men willing to do what he had done, to sign the papers and cash the checks and sleep at night by telling themselves it was legal. He bought a small ranch outside Redemption with the money he had saved. 40 acres, a cabin, enough land to run a few head of cattle and pretend that the past could be buried under honest work. Sarah never asked why he quit. She simply smiled and held Thomas and told Elias she was proud of him. 5 years of peace followed. 5 years of believing that redemption was possible, that a man could simply decide to be better, and the universe would accept that decision. Then, in the summer of 1878, the diphtheria came. Thomas was 5 years old. He died in 3 days. Elias held him at the end, felt the small body grow still, heard. Sarah's screams turned into something worse than screams, a silence that was louder than any sound. 2 weeks later, Sarah walked into the barn and hanged herself from the rafters. Elias found her at dawn. He cut her down and buried her next to Thomas in the plot behind the cabin. He did not cry. He had no tears left. He simply stood in the Montana wind and understood that the universe does not accept redemption. It only delays the reckoning. For 5 years after that, Elias lived alone. He worked the ranch because work was the only thing that made time pass. He spoke to no one unless commerce demanded it. He kept Thomas's room exactly as it had been, down to the wooden horse on the shelf and the primer with its careful illustrations of animals and letters. He had been teaching Thomas to read. The boy had been bright, curious, always asking why and how and what if. Elias never answered those questions. He never got the chance. And now on Christmas Eve, 1883, exactly 10 years after he had brought that group of Chinese laborers to Montana, he carried an unconscious Chinese girl into his cabin and laid her on the cot by the fireplace, the same cot where Thomas used to nap on winter afternoons. The fire was low. Elias built it up, adding logs until the flames cast dancing shadows across the rough pine walls. The cabin was small, just 2 rooms, but it was solid and warm. He had built it himself with his own hands, as if honest labor could somehow erase what he had done with paperwork and contracts. The girl did not wake as he removed her wet shoes, thin cloth slippers that had offered no protection against the snow. Her feet were blue with cold, and Elias wrapped them in wool blankets and placed them near the fire. He brought a basin of lukewarm water and a cloth and gently cleaned the frost from her face and hands. He did this with the same careful attention he had once given to Thomas when the boy had fever, the same helpless tenderness of someone who understands that care is often all we have to offer when we cannot provide a cure. It was only when he was hanging her wet coat to dry that he noticed it. Sewn into the lining, barely visible, was a piece of paper. Elias hesitated. To read it would be to invade her privacy. But she was unconscious in his home, and he had learned long ago that secrets could be dangerous. He unfolded the paper carefully. It was a list. Names written in both Chinese characters and English. 42 names. Next to each name was a notation. Some said deceased with a date. Others said unknown. A few had addresses, locations scattered across Montana and Wyoming. At the bottom of the list in different handwriting was a single sentence in English. "Find Mei Lin, she is still alive." Elias's hands began to shake. He knew these names, not all of them, but enough. This was the roster from 1873, the group he had brought from San Francisco, the list he had filed with the railroad company and then tried to forget. Someone had kept this list. Someone had been tracking these people for 10 years. He looked at the girl on the cot, really looked at her, and understanding came like a blow to the chest. When she woke, it was near midnight. The fire had settled into a steady glow, and Elias sat in a chair across the room watching. He had not moved in hours. He had simply waited because waiting was all he could do. Her eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the firelight. She did not start or cry out. She simply looked at him, taking in his face with the same distant recognition she had shown at the train station. When she spoke, her English was flawless, barely touched by an accent. "You don't remember me, do you?" Elias felt his throat constrict. He wanted to lie. He wanted to say, of course not. He had never seen her before in his life. But the lie would not come. "No," he said, "I don't." She sat up slowly, wincing as blood flow returned to her cold limbs. She pulled the blanket around her shoulders and looked at him with eyes that held no anger, only a terrible patience. "I was 12 years old," she said. "It was spring 1873. You came to San Francisco, to the boarding house on Waverly Street. You told my father that there was work in Montana, good work. He could bring his family. My mother had died the year before. It was just my father, my older brother, and me." Elias closed his eyes. He remembered Waverly Street. He remembered the boarding house, the crowded rooms, the faces of men desperate enough to believe a stranger offering hope. "You gave my father a contract," she continued. Her voice was steady, almost clinical. "He couldn't read English, so you explained it to him. Or you said you did. You told him he would earn wages, that there would be housing, that after 2 years the debt for passage would be paid, and he would be free to work wherever he wanted." "It was legal," Elias heard himself say, and hated the words even as they left his mouth. "It was slavery," she said simply. "You just called it something else." Silence filled the cabin, thick and suffocating. The fire cracked, sending sparks up the chimney. "My father's name was Chen Wei Han," she said. "My brother's name was Chen Jun. They died in a tunnel collapse on November 3rd, 1873. I know because I kept the telegram. The company sent it to the boarding house in San Francisco. It took 3 months to reach me because no one knew where I was. By then, I had been sold. Elias felt something inside him break, not his heart. That had broken years ago, something deeper, some last small belief that he might deserve to breathe the same air as other human beings. When the tunnel collapsed, she continued, the company decided they had too many workers. They needed to recoup costs, so they sold the women and children to whoever would pay. I was bought by a man named Chen Wei. No relation to my father, just the same surname. He ran a laundry in a town called Redemption. I've been working for him ever since. 10 years. She looked down at her hands. They were small, but the palms were calloused, scarred from years of lye soap and scalding water. My name is Chen Lihua, she said. And you, Mr. Morgan, are the man who killed my family. The words hung in the air like smoke. Elias wanted to deny them. He wanted to explain about the contracts, the legality, the fact that he had only been a middleman. He wanted to tell her about Thomas, about Sarah, about how he had suffered too. But he said nothing. Because she was right. The details did not matter. The contracts did not matter. He had taken money to bring her family to a place that killed them. Everything else was just words people used to make themselves feel better about unspeakable things. Why did you help me? Lihua asked. At the station. You could have left me there. Elias looked at her, really looked at her. She was so young. Younger than he had been when he signed his first contract. Younger than Sarah had been when she died. Young enough that she should have had a whole life ahead of her, not just the weight of 10 years spent paying for someone else's crime. I don't know, he said, and it was the first true thing he had said to her. She nodded as if she had expected this answer. The telegram about my father, she said. It listed the names of all the men who died, but it didn't list everyone who came on that journey. There were others, including a girl, Chen Mei Lin. She was 8 years old when we left San Francisco. She was my best friend, my only friend. Lihua reached into her dress and pulled out the photograph Elias had seen at the station. She held it up to the firelight. This is her family, she said. Her father, her mother, her 2 younger sisters. They all came on that journey. The parents died in the first year, the sisters scattered. But Mei Lin survived. I know because I saw her 3 years ago. She was working in a brothel in Butte. She didn't recognize me, or she pretended not to. Either way, she's still alive. And I need to find her. Why are you telling me this? Elias asked. Lihua smiled, but it was not a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who had learned that kindness was a luxury she could not afford. Because you're going to help me, she said. You're going to help me find her. And then when we do, you're going to look her in the eye and tell her what you did. You're going to apologize. And maybe, if you're very lucky, she won't spit in your face. Before Elias could respond, there was a knock at the door. He rose slowly, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle mounted above the fireplace. Visitors at midnight on Christmas Eve meant trouble. In Montana, in winter, people did not travel after dark unless something was very wrong. He opened the door a crack. Standing on his porch, flanked by 2 large men, Elias, recognized as hired muscle from the saloon in town, was a Chinese man in his mid-40s. He wore a heavy coat of good wool, and his face had the hardness of someone who had survived by learning never to show weakness. Mr. Morgan, the man said in English touched with a Cantonese accent. My name is Chen Wei. I believe you have something that belongs to me. Elias did not move to open the door further. I don't know what you're talking about. Chen Wei smiled. It was the smile of a businessman conducting a transaction he knew he would win. The girl, he said. Chen Lihua. She ran away from my establishment 3 days ago. I have been looking for her, and now I find her here in your home on Christmas Eve. What a fortunate coincidence. She needed help, Elias said. I found her at the station. She was freezing. How charitable of you, Chen Wei said. But charity does not alter the law. Miss Chen is bound to me by contract. She owes me 5 years of labor. I have the papers properly notarized. If you harbor her, you are breaking the law. Elias felt his jaw tighten. He knew Chen Wei was right. The law was clear. Indentured servitude was legal. The contracts were binding. A Chinese woman had no rights that would supersede a signed agreement. How much? Elias heard himself ask. Chen Wei raised an eyebrow. I beg your pardon. The debt. How much does she owe you? Chen Wei considered this. In monetary terms, perhaps $300. But I do not need money, Mr. Morgan. I need workers. Reliable workers are difficult to find. I'll pay 600, Elias said, and I'll work off the rest, whatever terms you want. It was an insane offer. $600 was more than Elias made in a year from the ranch. He would have to sell land, sell cattle. He would have to mortgage everything he owned. Chen Wei studied him with interest. Why would you do this? You don't know this girl. She is nothing to you. Elias looked back into the cabin where Lihua sat by the fire watching. Their eyes met, and in that moment he understood something he had not understood before. He could not bring back her father. He could not bring back her brother. He could not undo what he had done. But he could do this one thing. He could prevent it from happening again. Because I owe her, Elias said. Chen Wei laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. You owe her? How remarkable. Most white men do not believe they owe anything to people who look like us. He reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope. He held it out to Elias. I will make you a deal, Mr. Morgan. I will forgive Miss Chen's debt. Completely. No payment required. But you must do something for me in return. Elias took the envelope. What? Open it later, Chen Wei said. When you are ready. Inside is an address and a task. If you complete this task, the girl goes free. If you refuse, or if you fail, she comes back to me, and I will make sure she never runs again. Do we understand each other? Elias looked at the envelope. Every instinct told him not to agree, to refuse, to find another way. But he had no other way. He had no money, no leverage, nothing except the growing certainty that if he did not do this, Lihua would disappear back into whatever hell she had been living in for the past 10 years. I understand, he said. Chen Wei nodded. Good. You have until the end of January. That gives you 5 weeks. I suggest you do not waste time. He turned to leave, then paused. One more thing, Mr. Morgan. I know who you are. I know what you used to do. I know about the contracts, the workers, all of it. In fact, that is precisely why I am giving you this chance. Because you understand the business. You understand what is at stake. And you understand that some debts can never truly be repaid. With that, Chen Wei and his men walked back into the snow, disappearing into the darkness as silently as they had come. Elias stood in the doorway for a long moment, the envelope cold in his hand. The wind had picked up again, and snow swirled across the porch like ghosts dancing. When he finally closed the door and turned back to the cabin, Lihua was standing. What did he want? She asked. Elias held up the envelope. He says if I complete a task for him, you're free. The debt is forgiven. Lihua's expression did not change. And if you refuse, you go back. She nodded slowly as if she had expected this. What's the task? I don't know yet. They stood looking at each other across the small cabin, two people bound together by crimes committed a decade ago, by debts that could never be fully paid, by the simple fact that sometimes the universe puts you in a room with the last person you ever wanted to see and forces you to decide what kind of person you will be. You should open it, Lihua said. Elias broke the seal and pulled out a single piece of paper. On it was written an address in Butte, Montana. Below the address were 2 lines. The girl you are looking for is here. Bring her home. Elias felt his blood go cold. He looked at Lihua. Mei-Lin, she whispered. He knows where Mei-Lin is. This is a trap, Elias said. He knows what you've been looking for. He's using it to control both of us. Lihua sank back down onto the cot. For the first time since waking, she looked fragile, not weak. Fragile, like a blade that has been sharpened too many times and is on the verge of breaking. It doesn't matter if it's a trap, she said quietly. I have to go. I have to find her. We, Elias corrected. We have to find her. Lihua looked up at him, and for the first time something in her eyes softened. Not forgiveness, not trust, but perhaps the beginning of something like understanding. Why, she asked. Why would you help me? You don't owe me anything. You can't fix what you did. Elias walked to the fireplace and took down a wooden box from the mantel. He opened it and pulled out a letter. The letter he had come to the station to mail. The letter that had been in his saddlebag wrapped in oilcloth when he found Lihua in the snow. He handed it to her. "Read it," he said. Lihua unfolded the letter carefully. It was addressed to the territorial marshal in Helena. As she read, her eyes widened. The letter was a full confession. Every contract Elias had ever signed, every group he had brought from San Francisco, every death he had learned about, names, dates, locations. It was a legal document of self-incrimination, the kind of letter that would send a man to prison for years. "I was going to mail it tonight," Elias said. "I've been writing it for 6 months. I thought if I confessed, if I accepted punishment, maybe I could sleep again. Maybe the ghosts would leave me alone." He looked at the fire, at the shadows dancing on the walls. "But I found you instead. And now I realize that confessing to the law is the easy way. It's clean. Simple. I go to prison, I serve my time, and I tell myself I've paid my debt. But that's a lie. The debt isn't to the law. It's to people like you, people I harmed, people whose names I don't even know." Lihua held the letter with trembling hands. "So this is your redemption. Helping me find Mei Lin." "No," Elias said. "There is no redemption. Not for me. But maybe there's prevention. Maybe I can stop one more person from suffering the way you have. Maybe that's all I'm good for now." The fire crackled. Outside, the snow continued to fall, burying the world under its white silence. Lihua folded the letter and handed it back to him. "We leave in the morning," she said. "Patay is 3 days' ride in good weather. In this snow, it'll take 5. "You should rest tonight," Elias said. "You nearly froze to death." "I've been freezing for 10 years, Lihua said. "One more night won't make a difference." She lay back down on the cot, pulling the blanket up to her chin. Within minutes, her breathing had evened out into sleep. The sleep of someone who had learned to rest whenever the opportunity presented itself, because opportunity was rare and rest was rarer. Elias sat in his chair and watched her. He thought about his son, about Sarah, about the men who had died in the tunnel, about all the lives that had been broken so that railroads could be built and profits could be made, and men like him could tell themselves that business was business and law was law. He thought about the envelope still sitting on the table, about the address in Butte, about Chen Wei's cold smile. This was a trap. He was certain of it. Chen Wei did not forgive debts out of kindness. He wanted something more than just retrieving a lost worker. But what choice did Elias have? If he refused, Lihua would go anyway. She would walk into whatever Chen Wei had planned alone and unprotected. And Elias would return to his empty cabin and his empty life and the letter that he would eventually mail because guilt demanded it. Or he could go with her. He could walk into the trap knowing it was a trap. He could try one more time to be something other than what he had been. It would not fix anything. It would not bring back the dead. It would not erase the past. But maybe, just maybe, it would mean that when he finally mailed that letter and accepted his punishment, he could say he had at least tried to be better than the sum of his worst choices. Outside, the snow fell heavier now, covering the tracks they had made, covering the evidence of their arrival, making the world look clean and new and full of possibilities that Elias knew were lies. But in the morning they would ride anyway, into the trap, into the snow, into whatever came next. Because sometimes that's all redemption is. Not a grand gesture or a dramatic confession. Just two broken people deciding to keep moving forward, even when forward leads straight into the storm. Dawn came late to Montana in winter, arriving not with light, but with a gradual lessening of darkness, as if the sun itself was reluctant to witness what the world had become overnight. Elias woke to find Lihua already dressed, standing at the window watching the snow that had continued to fall through the night. It had buried the world under 3 feet of white silence, transforming the landscape into something both beautiful and treacherous. "We can't leave today," Elias said, his voice rough from sleep. "Not in this. The horses wouldn't make it a mile." Lihua did not turn from the window. "How long? 2 days, maybe 3. Depends on whether it stops or keeps falling." She nodded, accepting this with the patience of someone who had learned that fighting against weather was as futile as fighting against time. "Then we wait." Waiting, Elias discovered, was harder than riding would have been. In action, a man could lose himself, could focus on the immediate tasks of survival and navigation. But trapped in the cabin with nothing but time, and the woman whose family he had destroyed, there was nowhere to hide from the enormity of what lay between them. The first day passed in careful silence. Elias busied himself with maintaining the fire, checking on the horses in the small barn attached to the cabin, melting snow for water. Lihua moved through the space like a ghost, touching nothing, claiming no territory, as if even after being invited to stay, she believed her presence was temporary and conditional. It was late afternoon when she found Thomas's room. Elias had left the door open. He always left it open, some superstitious part of him believing that a closed door would make the emptiness inside more real. Lihua had been exploring the cabin's small second room, the one Elias used for storage, when she noticed the other door at the far end. She pushed it open and stood very still. The room was frozen in time, a child's bed neatly made, shelves lined with carved wooden animals, a small desk with a primer book still open to a page showing illustrations of letters. Above the bed, someone had painted a mural of horses running across a green field, the kind of place that existed only in imagination, in a land where winter lasted 8 months of the year. Elias found her standing in the doorway, her hand resting against the frame. "My son," he said quietly. "Thomas, he was 5 when he died." Lihua stepped into the room with a reverence usually reserved for churches. She moved to the desk and looked at the primer. Then she froze. In the margins of the book, in small, careful handwriting, were notes, Chinese characters, translations of the English words, phonetic spellings, small drawings to help illustrate meanings. "You learned Chinese," Lihua said. It was not a question. Elias stood in the doorway, unable to enter the room himself. He had not crossed that threshold in 5 years. "I tried. Sarah thought it would be good for Thomas to understand that there were other languages, other ways of seeing the world. And I thought maybe if I understood what the workers were saying when they thought I couldn't hear them, it would make what I was doing feel less like what it actually was. Did it work? No. It just meant I knew exactly what I was doing to them. I could hear their fear, their desperation, and I did it anyway because the contracts were legal and the money was good, and I told myself that made it right." Lihua picked up one of the wooden animals from the shelf, a horse carved with surprising detail, its mane flowing as if caught by wind. "Did you make these?" "Yes, I made one for every birthday, and sometimes just because I thought if I filled his room with beautiful things, he would grow up believing the world was beautiful." "What happened to him?" Elias leaned against the doorframe. The wood was cold and solid, the only thing keeping him upright. "Diphtheria. It swept through the territory that summer. Killed 20 children in Redemption alone. The doctor said there was nothing to be done. Just wait. Keep him comfortable. Pray." "Did you pray?" "Every hour. Every minute. I promised God I would do anything if Thomas lived. I would give up the ranch. I would give up everything I owned. I would confess my crimes and spend the rest of my life in prison. I would do anything." Lihua set the horse back on the shelf with careful precision. "But God didn't answer." Elias's voice went hollow. "No, or maybe he did, and the answer was that there are some things you can't bargain your way out of. Some debts that can't be paid with future promises." They stood in silence, Lihua in the room, Elias unable to enter, it separated by 5 years of grief and 10 years of guilt, and a distance that had nothing to do with physical space. "My mother died when I was 10, Lihua said softly. "Cholera. In Guangdong province there were outbreaks every summer. The rich people left the cities. The poor people died. We were poor." She turned to look at Elias, and her eyes held something he had not seen before. Not sympathy exactly, but recognition, the acknowledgement that suffering at least was something they shared. "My father never recovered," she continued. "He loved her so much that when she died, part of him died too. He kept working, kept taking care of us, but he was like a machine, going through the motions. When you came to the boarding house with your contracts, your promises of work and wages and a new life, he believed you because he wanted to believe. Because believing meant he might feel something again besides the emptiness." Elias felt his throat tighten. "I'm sorry." "I know, but sorry doesn't bring them back. Sorry doesn't undo what happened. Sorry is just a word we use when we want to feel better about things we can't fix." She walked past him out of the room, and Elias heard her footsteps moving toward the main room of the cabin. He stood alone in Thomas's doorway looking at the frozen childhood his son would never finish living and wondered if Lihua was right. If sorry was just another form of selfishness, another way of trying to escape the weight of actions that could never be undone. That evening, as the wind howled outside and the fire crackled in the hearth, Lihua broke the silence that had settled over them. "I need to tell you the truth," she said. Elias looked up from the harness he was mending. "About what? About why I came to Redemption, why I ran from Chen Wei, why I was at the station that night." She sat down across from him, the firelight casting shadows across her face that made her look older, harder, like someone who had learned that truth was a weapon and kindness was a luxury. "I told you I've been looking for Mei Lin, that's true, but I didn't tell you why or how long I've been searching." Elias set down the harness and gave her his full attention. 10 years ago, Lihua said, "when my father and brother died in that tunnel, I was 12 years old. I was sold to Chen Wei along with 5 other women and children from our group. He put us to work in his laundry. We worked 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. We lived in a room above the laundry that was smaller than this cabin. We ate rice and whatever vegetables were too old to sell. We were not slaves according to the law. We were indentured servants. We had contracts." Her voice was flat, emotionless, as if she was reciting facts about someone else's life. "For the first 2 years I believed what Chen Wei told us, that we were working off our passage debt, that eventually we would be free. But the debt never got smaller. There were always fees, housing fees, food fees, medical fees when one of us got sick. The numbers in his ledger made it clear we would never be free. We would die still owing him." Elias felt a familiar shame rising in his chest. This was what the contracts had always been. Slavery dressed up in legal language. Bondage with paperwork. "When I was 15, Lihua continued, I decided to find out what happened to the others from our group, the ones who hadn't been sold to Chen Wei. I started asking questions, writing letters. Most of the men were dead, accidents, disease. A few had disappeared, probably run away. But there were some who survived. And there were children. Children who had been 8, 9, 10 years old when they came, who were now young adults scattered across Montana and Wyoming. She reached into her dress and pulled out the folded list Elias had seen the night before. She spread it on the table between them. "This is what I've been building for 10 years. A record. Names, locations, what happened to each person who came on that journey. Some of the information came from other Chinese workers, some from church records, some from newspapers reporting on accidents. It took me 10 years to put this together because I could only work on it in stolen moments when Chen Wei wasn't watching." Elias looked at the list. 42 names, lives reduced to notations, deceased, unknown, last seen in, confirmed alive at. "Mei Lin's name is here," Lihua said, pointing to a name near the bottom. "She came with her parents and 2 younger sisters. The parents died in the first year. The sisters were separated and sold to different families. But Mei Lin, I found her 3 years ago. She was in Butte working in a brothel. I tried to buy her freedom, but I had no money. I tried to convince her to run, but she was too afraid. So I've been saving, stealing when I could, hiding coins, planning." She looked up at Elias, and her eyes were hard with determination. "I didn't come to Redemption by accident. I didn't run from Chen Wei on a whim. I've been planning this for a year. I knew that if I ran, Chen Wei would come after me. And I knew that if I could get to you, if I could find the man who brought us here in the first place, maybe you would help me. Out of guilt, if nothing else." Elias felt as if the ground had shifted beneath him. "You've been looking for me, specifically, for 2 years. I knew your name from the contracts. I knew you lived near Redemption. It took time to find exactly where, and then I had to wait for the right moment, when Chen Wei was distracted. When I had enough information about Mei Lin's location, when I was ready. So that night at the station, you weren't dying. You were waiting for me." Lihua shook her head. "No, I really was freezing. I misjudged how long I could survive in the cold. I thought I could make it until morning until the train came, but the temperature dropped faster than I expected. When you found me, I was maybe an hour from death. So in a way you did save my life, just not in the way you think." Elias leaned back in his chair trying to process this. Everything he had believed about that night, about his role in it, shifted into a new configuration. He had thought he was acting on impulse, on some last remaining shred of decency. But Lihua had been manipulating events, using his guilt as a tool, drawing him into her plan. He should have been angry. He should have felt used. Instead, he felt something like respect. "So this whole time," he said slowly, "you've been using me." "Yes." "And the letter Chen Wei gave me, the address in Butte. You think that's connected to Mei Lin?" "I know it is. There's only one brothel in Butte that keeps Chinese girls. That's where Mei Lin is, or was. Chen Wei knows this because he has connections in every Chinese community in the territory. He probably knew I was looking for her. He's been waiting for me to make a move. So this is a trap. He's using both of us." "Yes. But what choice do we have? I need to get Mei Lin out. And you need to help me, because if you don't, everything you claim to feel, all your guilt and remorse and desire for redemption, it's just words. Just empty words that make you feel better without actually changing anything." The truth of this hit Elias like a physical blow. She was right. The letter to the marshal, the confession, the self-flagellation, it was all performative. It was guilt without action, suffering without sacrifice. "So what do you want me to do?" he asked. "I want you to ride to Butte with me. I want you to help me get Mei Lin out of that brothel. I want you to use whatever skills you have, whatever connections you still have from your old life, to save one person. Just one. Out of all the people you helped destroy, save just one." She stood up, and in the firelight she looked like something forged in flame, hardened, unbreakable. "And then," she said, "after we save her, after we get her somewhere safe, then you can mail your letter. Then you can confess. Then you can go to prison and tell yourself you've paid your debt, but not before, not until you've done something that actually matters." Elias sat in silence for a long time. Outside the wind had died down, and the snow had finally stopped falling. The world was quiet, waiting. "All right," he said finally. "We'll do it. Together." For the first time since he had found her in the snow, Lihua smiled. It was a small smile, cautious and uncertain, but it was real. "Thank you," she said. And Elias realized that in all their conversations, those were the first words of gratitude she had spoken to him, not for saving her life, but for agreeing to help save someone else's. The next 2 days were spent in preparation. The snow had stopped, but the world was buried deep and travel would be slow and dangerous. Elias checked their supplies, rationed what food they had prepared the horses for a hard journey, but the real preparation was something else. It was the slow, careful process of two people learning to trust each other, not because they wanted to, but because survival demanded it. Elias taught Lihua to ride properly. She had ridden before, but always as a passenger, never in control. He showed her how to guide the horse, how to read its moods, how to conserve its strength over long distances. She was a quick study, picking up in hours what took most people weeks. In turn, Lihua taught him songs. Chinese songs her father had sung when she was young, songs about rivers and mountains and leaving home. She sang them quietly, her voice soft but clear, and Elias listened with his eyes closed, hearing in the foreign words something universal: longing, loss, hope. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Lihua paused in her singing. "My father used to sing this one," she said quietly, "on the ship from China. When people were sick, when children were crying, he would sing to calm them down. He had a terrible voice, but it didn't matter. The singing was about presence, not perfection." Elias looked at her across the flames. "He sounds like he was a good man." He was, not perfect. He made the decision to come to America based on promises he should have questioned more carefully. But he did it out of love, out of hope for a better future for us. That counts for something. She set down the bowl she had been holding and looked directly at Elias. "I've spent 10 years hating you, imagining what I would say if I ever found you, how I would make you understand what you had done, how I would make you suffer the way we suffered. You have every right to hate me. I know. But hate is exhausting. And it doesn't bring anyone back. It just keeps you trapped in the past, reliving the worst moments over and over until they're all you can see." She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I think I'm tired of hating. I think I want to try something else, not forgiveness. I'm not ready for that. Maybe I never will be. But maybe something like understanding. The knowledge that you're broken too, that what you did broke you just as much as it broke us." "It's not the same," Elias said, his voice rough with emotion. "My suffering is nothing compared to yours. No, it's not the same, but it's real. And maybe that's enough for us to work together, to save Mei Lin, to do one good thing in a world that seems designed to prevent good things from happening." Elias nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and then Lihua began to sing again. A different song this time. Not sad, not happy, just present. A song about the moment you're in, not the moments that came before or the ones that might come after. And Elias listened, and for the first time in years, he felt something like peace. The peace lasted exactly one more day. On the third morning after the snow, as they were loading the horses for departure, they heard the sound of multiple riders approaching. Elias's hand moved instinctively to his rifle, but before he could reach it, the riders emerged from the tree line. Sheriff Thomas Hale rode at the front, flanked by 4 deputies. They all carried rifles, and their expressions were grim with purpose. Elias stepped forward, placing himself between the riders and Lihua. "Sheriff," he said evenly, "what brings you out here?" Hale dismounted slowly. He was a man in his 50s, weathered by years of enforcing laws he did not always agree with but had sworn to uphold. His eyes held a mixture of regret and determination. "Elias Morgan," he said formally, "I'm here to place you under arrest for violation of the Territorial Labor Trafficking Act of 1875, conspiracy to commit fraud, and contributing to the deaths of 14 men in your capacity as a labor contractor for the Northern Pacific Railroad Company." The world seemed to stop. Elias heard the words, understood them, but could not quite believe they were real. "Who filed the charges?" he asked, though he already knew. Haley pulled a document from his coat. "Chen Wei. He submitted a full accounting of your activities between 1873 and 1878. Names, dates, contracts. He also provided testimony from survivors willing to testify against you. The territorial prosecutor says it's airtight." Elias looked past Hale to where Lihua stood, frozen by the horses. Her face had gone pale, and he could see the calculations running behind her eyes. Chen Wei had played them both. He had offered a deal knowing Elias would accept, and then had ensured that even if Elias completed the task, he would still end up in prison. "I'll come peacefully," Elias said, "but give me one day. Let me get her to safety first." Hale shook his head. "Can't do that, Elias. Orders are to bring you in immediately. The girl can stay here or return to Chen Wei. That's between them and the courts. She'll die if she goes back to him. That's not my jurisdiction. My jurisdiction is territorial law, and territorial law says you committed crimes, multiple crimes, and now you have to answer for them." Elias felt a strange calm settle over him. This was what he had wanted, wasn't it, to confess, to accept punishment, to finally face the consequences of what he had done. The letter in his saddlebag was his own confession. Chen Wei had simply beaten him to it. But looking at Lihua at the fear and betrayal in her eyes, he realized that his own redemption meant nothing if it left her trapped again. If it meant Mei Lin died in that brothel. If it meant all his talk of making amends was just another form of self-indulgence. He turned to Hale. "Sheriff, I'll make you a deal. You're not in a position to make deals. Let me finish this one thing. Let me ride to Butte and help her find someone. 5 days. Then I'll turn myself in. I'll plead guilty to everything. I'll make the prosecutor's job easy. But give me 5 days to do one good thing before I pay for all the bad ones." Hale considered this. Elias could see the internal struggle. The sheriff was not a bad man, just a man trying to do his job in a world where the law did not always align with justice. "Can't do it," Hale said finally. "I gave you a chance 5 years ago when I could have arrested you then. I looked the other way because you'd lost your family and seemed genuinely broken by what you'd done. But Chen Wei's testimony changes things. This is official now. I don't have discretion anymore." He gestured to his deputies. "Take him." 2 men moved forward with manacles, and then Lihua stepped between them. "No," she said simply. Everyone froze. "Miss, step aside," Hale said. "This doesn't concern you." "It does concern me. I'm Chen Lihua. I'm the one Chen Wei is trying to control. And I'm telling you that if you arrest this man now, you're helping a criminal control a victim. Chen Wei doesn't care about justice. He cares about making sure I can't escape him." "That may be true," Haley said carefully, "but it doesn't change the fact that Elias Morgan broke the law." "Then arrest us both," Lihua said, "because I'm going to help him escape, right now, and if you try to stop me, you'll have to shoot me." "Is that what you want? To shoot an unarmed Chinese woman on Christmas week? How do you think that will look in the newspapers?" Hale's face reddened. "You're threatening me. I'm telling you the truth. We're leaving. Together. You can try to stop us, or you can give us 5 days. Your choice." The tension stretched like a wire about to break. The deputies had their hands on their weapons. Elias could feel his heart pounding. This was insane. Lihua was going to get herself killed. But there was something in her stance and the absolute conviction of her voice that gave everyone pause. She was not bluffing. She would do exactly what she said. Hale looked from Lihua to Elias and back again. Then he sighed, a deep, weary sound. 5 days, he said quietly. Then you turn yourself in, Elias. To me, personally. At my office in Redemption. If you don't, I'll hunt you down. And I'll bring enough men that there won't be any standoffs or negotiations. Understood. Understood, Elias said. Hale remounted his horse. Before riding away, he looked at Lihua. You're making a mistake, miss. Helping a criminal flee won't end well for you. I'm not helping a criminal flee, Lihua said. I'm helping a person keep a promise. There's a difference. Hale shook his head and spurred his horse forward. The deputies followed, and within moments they had disappeared back into the trees. Elias turned to Lihua, shaking. That was the stupidest, bravest thing I've ever seen anyone do. It was necessary, she said simply. Now we have 5 days instead of however long it would have taken to break you out of jail. We should consider that an improvement. Why did you do it? You could have let them take me. Found another way to get to Mei Lin? Lihua looked at him for a long moment. Because I realized something while you were crying the other night. Watching you grieve for your son. Listening to you talk about the guilt you carry. I realized that if I let you go to prison now, before we save Mei Lin, I would be doing exactly what Chen Wei wants, using you and then throwing you away. And I don't want to be that person. I don't want to become what this world has tried to make me. She walked to her horse and mounted in one smooth motion. Besides, she added, you promised to help me, and I'm tired of promises being broken. So you're going to keep this one even if I have to threaten a sheriff to make it happen. Elias laughed. It was a broken, slightly hysterical sound, but it was genuine. You're terrifying, you know that. Good. Maybe that will keep us alive in Butte. They rode out of the ranch as the sun was climbing toward its pale winter zenith. Two fugitives bound together by crimes past and promises present, heading toward a city where a girl waited in chains, unaware that her rescue was 5 days away and might cost everything. As they disappeared into the white landscape, the cabin stood empty behind them. Thomas's room still frozen in time, the wooden animals still lined up on their shelf waiting for a child who would never return to play with them again. But in the saddlebags wrapped in oilcloth was a letter that would not be mailed. Not yet. Not until one promise had been kept. Because redemption, Elias was learning, was not about grand gestures or legal confessions. It was about the small, difficult choice to keep moving forward even when every instinct screamed to give up. To help one person when you had harmed many. To try knowing you would probably fail because the trying itself was all that separated humans from the indifferent cruelty of the world. They had 5 days. It would have to be enough. The journey to Butte should have taken 3 days in good weather. In the deep snow of late December, with 2 riders pushing their horses as hard as they dared, it took 4.5. They rode through landscapes transformed into something otherworldly by winter, through forests where snow hung so heavy on pine branches that entire trees bent under the weight, through valleys where the wind carved the drifts into shapes that looked almost deliberate, as if some vast intelligence was trying to communicate in a language made only of white and silence. They spoke little during the ride. Conversation required energy they could not spare, and besides there was a kind of understanding that had developed between them that made words feel unnecessary. When Lihua grew too cold, Elias would stop without being asked and build a small fire. When Elias's hands became too numb to properly hold the reins, Lihua would take the lead, guiding both horses with a competence that surprised him. On the third night, they found shelter in an abandoned line shack halfway up a mountain pass. The structure was little more than 4 walls and a roof built decades ago for shepherds who no longer worked these ranges, but it had a fireplace and 4 solid walls, which made it a palace compared to sleeping in the open. Elias got the fire going, while Lihua tended to the horses, making sure they were sheltered in the small lean-to attached to the shack. When she came back inside, stamping snow from her boots, her face was red with cold, but her eyes were bright. "The stars are incredible tonight," she said. "I've never seen so many." Elias looked up from the fire. "You should sleep. We have another hard day tomorrow." "I'm not tired yet, and we've been riding for 3 days without really talking. I think we should talk." "About what?" Lihua sat down across the fire from him, pulling her coat tighter. "About what we're going to do when we get to Butte. About the plan. The plan is simple. We find the brothel. We get Maylin out. We leave. And if they won't let her go, then we make them." "How?" Elias was quiet for a moment. He had been avoiding thinking too carefully about the specifics because the specifics required him to confront truths he preferred to leave unexamined. "I still have contacts in Butte, men I worked with during the railroad days. Some of them owe me favors. Some of them are not good people, but they're useful people. I can call in those favors." "You mean you're going to use the same network you used to traffic people to save one person?" "Yes." Lihua studied him across the flames. "Does that feel like redemption to you? Using the tools of your crime to fix a small piece of what you broke? No, it feels like pragmatism. Redemption is a luxury we don't have time for." She nodded slowly. "Good. I'm glad you understand that. Because I need you to understand something else. When we find Maylin, if we find her, I need you to tell her the truth. About who you are. What you did. I need her to know that the man who brought her to this country, who started the chain of events that led to her being in that brothel, is the same man who got her out. Why does that matter? Because truth matters. Because if we save her, and she never knows the full story, then we're just repeating the same pattern. Making decisions for her, controlling information, treating her like she's too fragile or too ignorant to handle reality. And that's what everyone has been doing to people like us since we got here. Deciding what we need to know, what's best for us. I won't do that, not even to spare your feelings." Elias felt the familiar weight of shame settle over him. "She'll hate me." "Probably, but at least she'll hate you with full knowledge. At least her feelings will be based on truth, not manipulation." The fire crackled between them, and outside the wind picked up, rattling the shack's loose boards. "What if this is all for nothing?" Elias asked quietly. "What if we get there and she's already dead? Or gone? What if Chen Wei sent us on a fool's errand just to watch us fail?" Lihua looked into the fire for a long time before answering. "Then at least we tried, at least we made the journey. At least we chose to act instead of just accepting that the world is cruel and there's nothing to be done about it." She pulled something from her pocket, the photograph, the one she had been holding when Elias found her at the train station. She stared at it, and in the firelight, Elias could see tears gathering in her eyes. "This is her family," Lihua said softly. "Maylin's mother, father, and sisters. They all died within a year of arriving in America. Maylin was the only one who survived. And for what? To end up in a brothel, to be used by men who see her as something less than human, to die alone in a strange land where no one even knows her real name. We don't know that she's alone." "Yes, we do, because if she had anyone, she wouldn't still be there. She would have escaped. She would have found help. The fact that she's still trapped means she has no one, no family, no friends, no hope, no—" Lihua's voice broke on the last word, and the tears she had been holding back finally fell. "I've been searching for her for 10 years, she continued. 10 years of saving every penny, of asking questions, of following rumors and dead ends. And now I'm so close. We're so close. But I'm terrified that when we get there, it will be too late. That all this effort, all this time, will have been for nothing." Elias moved around the fire to sit beside her. He did not touch her, but his presence was a comfort, a solid warmth in the cold darkness. "When I lost Thomas," he said quietly, "I thought the pain would kill me. I wanted it to kill me. I would lie awake at night and try to will my heart to stop beating because a world without him in it seemed like a world not worth living in. But the heart is stubborn. It keeps beating even when you beg it to stop. And eventually, I realized that the pain wasn't trying to kill me. It was trying to teach me something. What? That love doesn't end when the person you love dies. It just changes shape. It becomes something you carry instead of something you share, and the burden of it, the unbearable heaviness of loving someone who isn't there anymore. That burden is the price we pay for having loved them in the first place. And it's worth it. Even when it doesn't feel worth it. Even when the weight crushes you. It's still worth it. Lihua leaned her head against his shoulder, a gesture of trust that felt more intimate than any embrace. What if Maylin doesn't remember me? What if 10 years has erased who she was, and the person we find is just a shell? Then we help the shell become a person again. We give her time. We give her space. We give her whatever she needs to heal. And if she never fully heals, if the damage is too deep, then we sit with her in the brokenness and we don't abandon her. Because that's what love is. Not fixing people, just refusing to leave them alone in their pain. They sat together in the firelight, two broken people holding each other up, and outside the snow began to fall again, soft and relentless, covering the world in white forgiveness that would melt come spring. But for now was all the grace the universe had to offer. They reached Butte on the afternoon of the 4th day. The city sprawled across the mountainside like a wound, all mine shafts and slag heaps and buildings thrown up too quickly to have any claim to beauty. Smoke from countless chimneys turned the winter sky gray, and even from a distance they could hear the constant hammer of industry, the sound of a place where human beings were currency and mountains were obstacles to be destroyed in the pursuit of copper and silver and gold. The brothel was in the Chinese Quarter, a cramped neighborhood where buildings leaned against each other like tired drunks, where laundry hung frozen on lines between windows where the faces Elias saw were carefully blank-trained by experience to reveal nothing to white strangers. They left the horses at a stable run by a man Elias recognized from the old days, a former railroad foreman who asked no questions and accepted payment with a grunt that might have been greeting or dismissal or both. Then they walked through narrow streets slick with ice until they found the building Chen Wei's letter had described. It was 3 stories tall, wood painted red, that had faded to the color of old blood. A sign above the door displayed Chinese characters Elias could not read. The windows on the upper floors were barred, and even in daylight, lamplight flickered behind dirty glass. "This is it," Lihua whispered. Her face had gone pale, and her hands were shaking. Elias put a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to go in. I can do this alone." "No, I need to see her. I need to know she's real, that I didn't spend 10 years chasing a ghost." They approached the door together. It opened before Elias could knock, and a man stood in the doorway. He was Chinese, perhaps 50, with eyes that had seen too much and felt too little. When he saw Lihua, something flickered across his face. Recognition, maybe, or resignation. "Chen Lihua," the man said in Cantonese. Then switching to English for Elias's benefit, "Chen Wei said you would come." "Where is she?" Lihua demanded. "Where is Maylin?" The man's expression did not change. "You should come inside." He led them through a dim hallway that smelled of opium and cheap perfume and human desperation. Up a narrow staircase, along another hallway, where doors stood closed against secrets better left undiscovered. At the end of the hall, he stopped at a door that looked like all the others. He opened it. The room beyond was small, barely large enough for the narrow bed and single chair it contained. A window looked out onto an alley where snow had piled into drifts of brown and gray. And on the bed, covered with a thin blanket, lay a body. Lihua made a sound that was not quite a scream, not quite a sob. She rushed forward, falling to her knees beside the bed. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." The woman on the bed was dead. Had been dead for perhaps a day, maybe less. Her face was peaceful in a way that death sometimes allows, but there was no mistaking the stillness, the absolute absence that separates sleep from its permanent cousin. Elias felt his legs go weak. They had come all this way, risked everything, and they were too late. "What happened?" he asked the man who had led them here. "Sickness," the man said flatly. "Fever. It took her 3 days ago. She died this morning." "Why didn't you send for a doctor? Doctors don't come here, not for girls like her." Lihua was bent over the body, her hand clutching the dead woman's cold fingers, making sounds of grief so raw they seemed to tear the air itself. Elias moved to her side, wanting to comfort her, but knowing that some grief is too large to be comforted. And then he saw it, the face. Even in death, even changed by illness and hardship and the passage of 10 years, he recognized the face. It was the girl from the photograph, the 8-year-old child he had transported in that livestock car a decade ago. The girl who had traveled with her family, who had watched her parents die, who had survived only to end up here, in this room, dying alone of a fever that a doctor might have cured if anyone had cared enough to try. Mei Lin. The realization crashed over Elias like an avalanche. He had brought her here. He had signed the contract that put her in that livestock car. He had collected his fee when she and her family arrived. And now she was dead, and the chain of causation that led from his signature to this moment, to this cold body in this terrible room, was unbroken and undeniable. He sank to his knees beside Lihua, his chest collapsing, inward breath deserting him. For the second time in 5 days, grief tore through him with a force that left him shaking. They stayed in that room for hours. The man who had led them there eventually left, closing the door quietly behind him. Lihua washed Mei Lin's body with water from a basin, performing the ritual with a tenderness that spoke of love that had survived 10 years of separation. She combed the dead girl's hair, straightened her limbs, covered her with the one good blanket they could find. Elias watched, feeling useless and hollow, until Lihua finally spoke. "Help me," she said. "I can't carry her alone. Where are we taking her? Out of here, somewhere clean, somewhere she can have a real burial." They wrapped Mei Lin's body in blankets and carried her down the stairs past the man who watched them with that same flat expression, out into the street where twilight was falling and the temperature was dropping toward another brutal night. Elias had money, not much, but enough. He found a Chinese mortuary and paid for a coffin for a plot in the small cemetery on the hillside where Chinese immigrants buried their dead beneath headstones carved with characters that most white residents of Butte could not read and did not care to learn. The burial was the next morning, just Elias, Lihua, and the mortician, who recited prayers in a language Elias did not understand. They stood in the falling snow as Mei Lin was lowered into the frozen ground, and when it was done, Lihua placed the photograph on the grave, the one she had carried for 10 years, the image of Mei Lin's family together and whole and alive. "I'm sorry," she whispered to the grave. "I'm sorry I didn't find you in time. I'm sorry I couldn't save you. I'm sorry for everything." She turned and walked away, her shoulders trembling with silent grief. Elias started to follow, but movement at the edge of the cemetery stopped him. A man stood there, partially hidden by the trees. Even at a distance, even through the snow, Elias recognized him, Chen Wei. They stared at each other across the graveyard, across the space between perpetrator and victim, across 10 years of pain and lies and manipulation. Then Chen Wei began to walk toward him. He moved like a man in a dream, his steps slow and uncertain. When he reached Mei Lin's grave, he fell to his knees. "My daughter," he said in English, his voice cracking. "My little girl." Elias felt confusion wash over him. "What?" Chen Wei looked up, and his face was destroyed. Not with anger, with grief so profound it had stripped away every defense, every mask, leaving only raw human suffering. "Mei Lin was my daughter," he said, "my only child. When my wife died crossing the ocean in 1872, I arrived in America alone. I left Mei Lin with my wife's family in Guangdong. I was going to send for her. I was going to bring her to me as soon as I had enough money, as soon as I had a stable home to offer her." He paused, his hands shaking. "But my wife's relatives were starving. A drought destroyed their crops. They needed money desperately. When your labor contractor came through the province in 1873 offering cash for workers offering to take whole families, they sold Mei Lin and the family they had placed her with. They told themselves they were giving her a chance at a better life in America. They took the money and survived another year." Chen Wei's voice cracked. I didn't know. I was in San Francisco working, sending letters that went unanswered because the relatives had moved to avoid their shame. When I finally learned what happened, it was from a letter that reached me 6 months after the fact. Maylin was already in Montana, already on that train heading to the work camps. He looked at Elias with eyes hollowed by grief. I sold everything I owned. I traveled to Montana. I arrived in Redemption in November of 1873, 1 week after the tunnel collapse. The company was liquidating assets, selling off the women and children from that work group to recoup their losses. I had money. I bought as many as I could. 7 people, including Lihua. But Maylin had already been sold 3 days earlier. Cash transaction. A brothel owner from Butte who paid immediately and left before I arrived. His hands clenched into fists. The company clerk wouldn't tell me which girl had been sold where. Privacy of business transactions, he said. It took me 3 years to track down which Chinese girls from that group had ended up in brothels. Another 4 years to confirm which one was my daughter. By then she was 15 years old. I tried to buy her freedom, but the brothel owner wanted 10 times what I could afford. So I built my business. I controlled the Chinese community in Redemption, not for power, but for information. Every worker who came through, I asked about girls in Butte. Every traveler I questioned. I was building toward the moment I could finally afford to bring her home. Chen Wei's voice dropped to a whisper. He reached out and touched the fresh earth covering the grave, his hands trembling. I've been searching for her for 10 years. He continued, his voice barely above a whisper, building my business, making connections, controlling the Chinese community in Redemption, not for power, but so I could track every person who passed through, hoping one day I would find her. And I did. 3 months ago, someone told me about a Chinese girl in a Butte brothel who matched her description. I finally had enough money saved. I sent word that I was coming to buy her freedom. He looked up at Elias, his eyes hollow. But then Lihua ran away, and I knew she was looking for Maylin too. I knew she would try to rescue her, probably fail and get both of them killed. So I made a choice. I manipulated both of you. I sent you after her, thinking you would be faster than my careful legal negotiations, thinking your guilt and her determination would get Maylin out before I could finalize the paperwork. I planned to arrive at the last moment, claim the credit, and finally have my daughter back. Chen Wei's voice broke completely. But we were all too late. All of us. With all our plans and our guilt and our need for redemption, we were still too late. Elias felt reality rearrange itself around him. Everything he had believed about Chen Wei, about the mission, about what they were doing, had been wrong. Or not wrong exactly, just incomplete. Missing the crucial piece that changed everything. "You're her father," he said dumbly. "Yes." "And I brought her to America. In that livestock car. I signed the contract." "Yes." "So I killed your daughter." Chen Wei looked at him with eyes that held no anger, only an exhaustion so complete it seemed to have aged him decades in moments. "We all killed her," he said. "You with your contracts, the relatives who sold her, the brothel owners who bought her, the men who used her, the doctors who wouldn't treat her, the system that made her less than human. We all did this. We're all responsible." He pulled something from his coat, a pistol, old but well-maintained. "I thought when I found the man who brought her here I would kill him," Chen Wei said, looking at the gun. "I thought that would make the pain stop. But now I realize killing you would be too easy. For both of us, we'd both escape. You through death, me through the satisfaction of revenge. But our daughters would still be dead, and nothing would have changed." He put the barrel of the gun to his own temple. "So perhaps this is better. Perhaps if I follow her, if I leave this world that allowed such things to happen, that will be the only redemption possible." "Don't," Elias said, stepping forward. "Why not give me one reason why I should continue living in a world that took my daughter from me?" And Elias found himself saying words he had not known he was going to say, words that came from somewhere deeper than thought. "Because there are others, other daughters, other sons, other people trapped in the same system that killed Maylin, and if we die, if we take the easy way out, no one saves them. No one even tries." Chen Wei's hand was shaking, the gun trembling against his skull. "I can't save them. I couldn't even save her." "No, you couldn't. Neither could I. Neither could Lihua. We all failed. But that doesn't mean we have to keep failing. That doesn't mean every Malin in every brothel has to die alone. What are you suggesting? Elias looked at the grave, at the photograph slowly being covered by snow, at the fresh earth that held the body of a girl who had deserved so much better than what the world had given her. I have money, he said. Not much, but some. I was going to use it to run, to escape. But I don't need to escape anymore. I'm going to turn myself in when we get back to redemption. I'm going to prison. But before I do, I want to use that money to buy freedom for as many people as we can, to break as many contracts as possible, to get as many people out of situations like Malin's as we can reach. He turned to Chen Wei. Help me. You have connections. You have knowledge. You know where these people are, who owns their contracts, how the system works. Together we could save some of them. Not all, but some. Isn't that better than nothing? Isn't that better than dying and leaving them all behind? Chen Wei lowered the gun slowly. You would do this, spend your money to free strangers. They're not strangers. They're people I helped enslave, people I owe a debt I can never fully repay. But I can make a start. We can make a start. For a long moment, Chen Wei was silent. Then he nodded. All right, he said. We'll try. They walked back through the cemetery together, two men bound by the death of a girl they had both failed, heading toward a future neither of them had imagined, but both now felt compelled to create. Lihua was waiting at the gates. When she saw them together, saw Chen Wei alive, saw something had shifted between them. Her eyes widened. What happened? A new plan, Elias said. We're going to help as many people as we can, free as many contracts as we can. Use whatever time I have left before prison to do something that actually matters. Lihua looked from Elias to Chen Wei and back again. Then, to Elias's surprise, she shook her head. No, she said. I don't want you to spend money buying freedom. I don't want Chen Wei to use his connections to manipulate contracts. That's not redemption. That's just rearranging the same broken system. Then what do you want? Lihua's eyes were fierce, burning with an intensity that seemed to warm the winter air around her. I want you to tell the truth. All of it. I want you to go to every person you helped bring to this country and look them in the eye and tell them what you did. I want you to apologize, not with money, not with favors, with words, with honesty, with the acknowledgement that you harmed them and you're sorry. That's what I want. Lihua, that's insane. Some of those people are scattered across 3 territories. Some of them might try to kill me. Then let them try. At least they'll have the choice. At least they'll have the agency to decide how they want to respond to your confession. But you don't get to hide behind money or legal systems or grand gestures. You have to face what you did, person by person, name by name. That's the only redemption that means anything. Chen Wei was nodding. She's right. Buying contracts just perpetuates the idea that people can be bought and sold. Breaking contracts through connections just shows that the system can be manipulated by those with power. But confession, truth, that changes the narrative. That says we acknowledge what was done was wrong regardless of what the law said. Elias felt panic rising in his chest. What they were asking was so much harder than prison. Prison was finite. 5 years, 10 years, whatever the sentence. But this would require him to spend however much time he had left confronting his victims, opening himself to their anger and their pain, with no guarantee of forgiveness or absolution. I can't, he said. I'm not strong enough. You are, Lihua said, taking his hand. You're stronger than you think, and you won't do it alone. I'll come with you. We'll do it together. Why would you do that? Why would you help me confess to crimes against your own people? Because witnessing matters. Because if it's just you alone confessing to scattered individuals, it becomes about your guilt, your pain, your need for release. But if I'm there, if other survivors are there, it becomes about them, about their pain, about giving them the space to speak and be heard and decide how they want to respond. That's what justice looks like. Not punishment, not revenge. Just the simple act of being seen and heard by the person who harmed you. And Elias looked at this young woman who had every reason to hate him, who could have let him die a dozen times over the past week, who was now offering to spend her freedom helping him face the consequences of his actions. Why, he asked. After everything, Why would you do this for me? Lihua's expression softened. I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it for everyone like me who never got to confront the people who hurt them, who never got to speak their truth, who never got to watch their victimizer acknowledge what they did. I'm doing it because Mei Lin deserves to have her story told, because my father and brother deserve to have their names spoken aloud by the man who contributed to their deaths, because truth matters even when it's painful, especially when it's painful. The three of them stood together in the cemetery as the snow continued to fall, making a plan that would take years, that would require resources and time, and a commitment to discomfort that none of them were certain they could sustain. But they were going to try. They returned to Redemption 5 days after leaving, exactly as Elias had promised Sheriff Hale. The sheriff was waiting in his office when they arrived, his face a mixture of relief and resignation. "Thought you might run," he said. "I made a promise," Elias replied. "The girl, too." Hale looked at Lihua. "You're free to go. Chen-Wei withdrew his claim on your contract." Lihua shook her head. "I'm staying. I'm going to testify at the trial. I'm going to tell the court exactly what Mr. Morgan did and how it affected me and my family." Hale raised an eyebrow. "That'll make the prosecutor's job easier." "Good. I don't want there to be any question about guilt. I want the truth to be clear." The trial took place in February. It lasted 3 days. Elias pled guilty to all charges, but the judge insisted on hearing testimony anyway, wanted the full scope of the crimes entered into the public record. Lihua testified. So did Chen-Wei. So did 7 other Chinese laborers who had survived the conditions Elias had sent them into. They spoke of promises broken, of contracts that became traps, of deaths that could have been prevented if anyone had cared enough to try. Elias sat through all of it, listening, not defending himself, not explaining, just listening, bearing witness to the harm he had caused. The sentence was 7 years. With good behavior, possibly 5. On the day they took him to the territorial prison in Deer Lodge, Lihua was there. She had something in her hands, a ledger. "This is every name from every contract you signed," she said. "Chen-Wei helped me compile it. There are 83 people still alive, scattered across Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho. While you're in prison, I'm going to find them. I'm going to interview them. I'm going to document their stories. Why? Because when you get out, we're going to visit every single one of them. You're going to apologize, and I'm going to make sure their stories are preserved, written down, given to libraries and historical societies, so that people in the future will know what happened, will know their names, will understand that the railroads and the mines and all the progress everyone celebrates was built on suffering, on lives like Mei Lin's, like my father's, like mine." Elias took the ledger with shaking hands. 83 names, 83 apologies, 83 chances to face what he had done. "I'll do it," he said. "All of it, however long it takes." "Good, because I'm not giving you a choice." She turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing. Chen-Wei and I are starting a fund, the Redemption Fund. We're using my settlement money from the lawsuit against the railroad company and Chen-Wei's savings. We're going to buy out as many labor contracts as we can, free as many people as possible. It won't fix the system, but it's something." "That's good," Elias said. "That's really good. It's not enough. It will never be enough, but it's a start." The prison doors closed behind Elias with a finality that felt appropriate. 5 years, maybe 7, time to sit with what he had done, time to prepare for the harder work that would come after, time to learn that redemption was not a destination but a direction, not something you achieved, but something you moved toward, knowing you would never fully arrive. 5 years passed slowly. Elias worked in the prison workshop making furniture that would be sold to fund the prison operations. He taught himself to read Chinese, working through textbooks Lihua sent him, preparing for the conversations he would need to have with people who might not speak English. Lihua visited once a month. She brought updates on the Redemption Fund, which had freed 37 people in the first 3 years. She brought stories from the survivors she had interviewed, carefully transcribed testimonies that she was compiling into a book. Chen-Wei visited 2 less frequently, but his visits meant something. 2 men who had every reason to hate each other, finding a kind of peace in shared purpose. And then, after 5 years and 2 months, the doors opened and Elias walked out into spring sunlight. Lihua was waiting. Her hair had gray in it, now premature aging from stress and hard work. But her eyes were clear, and when she smiled, it was real. "Ready?" she asked. "No, but let's go anyway." They traveled for the next 3 years, Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, and into California. 83 names became 83 conversations. The first conversation happened in a mining town outside Helena. The man's name was Zhang Wei, 52 years old, missing 3 fingers from a blasting accident in 1875. He lived alone in a shack at the edge of town, surviving on odd jobs and the charity of the Chinese community. When Elias knocked on his door and introduced himself, Zhang Wei stared at him for a long moment, then spat at his feet. "I know who you are," he said in heavily accented English. "You are the ghost who sold us." "I'm here to apologize," Elias said, "for what I did, for the lies I told, for the suffering I caused." "Apologize?" Zhang Wei laughed bitterly. "You think words fix broken hands? You think sorry brings back my brother who died in the tunnel? You think I forgive because you feel bad now?" "No, I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that I acknowledge what I did, that I see you, that I remember." Zhang Wei was silent for a long time. Then he held up his ruined hand. "You see this company doctor, he cut off fingers with saw. No medicine, no clean blade, just saw and whiskey. I screamed for 3 hours. You hear that scream in your dreams? No. Then you don't really see, you don't really remember, you just want to feel better about yourself." The old man started to close the door, then paused. "But you came. That is something. Most men like you, they hide. They pretend it never happened. You came. So maybe you are less of a ghost than I thought." He closed the door. Elias stood on the porch for several minutes, Lihua beside him. "That's one," she said softly. 82 to go." Not all conversations ended in partial acceptance. In Missoula, a woman threw boiling water at Elias and screamed at him in Cantonese until neighbors came running. In Boise, a man pulled a knife and chased him 3 blocks before Lihua intervened. In Sacramento, an elderly woman simply looked at him and said, "You are already punished. I see it in your eyes. I don't need to add to it." But there were also unexpected moments. In a small town in Wyoming, a man named Liu Chen listened to Elias's apology, then invited him inside for tea. "I hated you for many years," Liu Chen said, "but hate is a hungry ghost. It eats you from inside. I decided 10 years ago to stop feeding it. Your apology does not change the past, but it changes the present. It tells me that maybe people can learn, can grow, can become something better than what they were." He poured tea with steady hands. "My son is in university now, in San Francisco. He is studying law. He wants to change the labor system so no one else suffers like we did. Your apology gives me hope that when he fights that system, maybe some people will listen, because if you can change, maybe others can too." These were the conversations that kept Elias moving forward when shame threatened to paralyze him, not the forgiveness which came rarely and felt undeserved, but the acknowledgement that the act of apologizing, of witnessing, of refusing to hide from the consequences of his actions meant something to the people he had harmed. Each name, each story, each face he would carry with him for the rest of his life. But each conversation happened, each apology was offered, each story was heard. By the time they finished, Elias was 43 years old and Lihua was 32. They were both exhausted, both changed by the work, both uncertain what came next. They returned to redemption on a winter day, much like the one when they had first met. Snow falling soft and silent. The world white and clean and full of deceptive promises. The cabin still stood, though it needed repairs. Thomas's room was covered in dust. The wooden animals still lined up on their shelves waiting. Elias and Lihua stood together at the window watching the snow fall, their hands not quite touching, but close enough to feel the warmth. "What now?" Elias asked. "I don't know. We've spent 8 years working on the past. Maybe it's time to think about the future." What kind of future? Lihua looked at him, really looked at him, seeing not the man who had harmed her family, but the man who had spent 8 years trying to make amends, not forgiven, but perhaps understood. The kind where we keep going, where we keep trying, where we build something new out of all the broken pieces. Together, she smiled. I can't think of anyone else who would put up with me. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the old tracks, making the world look new again. It was a lie, of course. The past could not be erased. The harm could not be undone. But perhaps in the space between what was and what might be there was room for something like hope, not redemption. That word was too grand, too final, too full of false promises. But movement, direction, the simple choice to keep trying to be better than what you were knowing you would fail. Knowing the failures would hurt, but trying anyway, because the trying was all that separated humans from the cruelty of an indifferent universe. They had 83 conversations behind them and an uncertain number of days ahead. They had Maylin's grave to visit each year, to remember, to honor. They had the redemption fund to maintain, to grow, to pass on to others who would continue the work. They had each other, bound not by love in any traditional sense, but by something deeper. Shared purpose, mutual understanding. The recognition that some journeys can only be made together, even when alone would be easier. The snow fell, the fire burned, and two people who had every reason to hate each other chose instead to try something harder. They chose to build a future worthy of the people they had failed. It would take the rest of their lives. It would never be enough. But it was something, and sometimes in a world that offers so little, something is everything.